The fall of al-Fashir in Sudan has been as catastrophic as many feared. The footage is, just put simply, unbearable. Thousands have already been killed, and the numbers you're seeing now are undoubtedly underestimates. And up to 160,000 people are still trapped in al-Fashir, which, for the last 18 months, has been besieged by the Rapid Support Forces known as the RSF or the Janjaweed. The massacres in al-Fashir have been so intense that they can actually be seen through satellite images. These images, for instance, are from the Yale School of Public Health Humanitarian Research Lab, and they show bodies and pools of blood, again, from satellite imagery. The UAE-backed RSF is responsible for these massacres, and are being accused of ethnic cleansing of indigenous populations, such as the Masalit and the Fur people. And all of this comes in the context of a war, which has raged since April 2023, which has created the world's largest humanitarian crisis, with millions of people displaced and millions facing hunger and disease. With the fall of al-Fashir, there's been a huge wave of international condemnation and calls of solidarity, the scale of which, as far as I know, hasn't been seen throughout the entirety of this war. The most remarkable of these are the messages from the people in Gaza.
أخيرا خلصنا من حرب فلسطين، أنا بعد هيك مش رح أتضامن مع حدا.
طب احنا بالسودان وضعنا صعب.
السودان هاي وين؟
بلد عربي بأفريقيا.
شو لون بشرتكم، أبيض ولا أسود؟
إذا مش دخل البشرة في الموضوع.
بس بسأل.
أسود.
ولا آسف بقدرش أتضامن، شكرا.
But of course, with a lot of new people, I've seen some pretty bad takes, or even just people getting things wrong. But I have absolutely no interest in calling people out, especially well-meaning people, but also in this time of urgency. Instead, consider this a call-in video to help people who may not be as familiar with Sudan, its revolution, or the current war, who want to get involved. So, I've created a list of 10 things to do and not do when it comes to standing in solidarity with Sudan. So before anyone asks themselves, why is this white guy talking about Sudan? Firstly, I'm not white. I'm just a pale-skinned Arab. But secondly, I have been writing about Sudan for the last 3 years. The first thing I did was a long-form comic on the Sudanese revolution, which I released in 2022. And since then, I've done a bunch of interviews with Sudanese activists and commentators, as well as most recently a video essay about the Sudanese revolution. All these things, of course, I will put in the show notes. But of course, that's not to say that I am an authority on Sudan, but merely that I'm not some rando who's just read a few Insta posts and is now here to lecture the rest of you. So with that said, here's the list of 10 things to help foster respectful and effective solidarity with the people of Sudan. Number 1. Center Sudanese voices and perspectives. So this first one I think might be obvious for some, but it is definitely something that needs to be constantly reminded, that whenever we're dealing with a situation in which we are standing in solidarity with another group of people, it is always important to center their voices, their perspectives, and therefore, we should all be following Sudanese accounts on social media, reading Sudanese writers, and familiarizing ourselves with Sudanese organizations. Ideally, these organizations and voices should also be from people within the Darfur region, but also other Sudanese people who have identified with the revolution, those who situate Darfur within the wider struggle. Because one problem that does exist, that I've heard a lot of Sudanese talk about, is that there is this tendency within Sudanese society, especially in the north, to separate Darfur from the rest of the country. This is part of the historical marginalization, which has led Sudan to this point, in part. And so here on this point, I don't think it's enough just to read, or to see comments and then just amplify the comments, but to really learn from them. Always in a situation of standing in solidarity with people, you should represent them, amplify them, but never replace them. One thing that I think everybody should be reading if you really want to A, understand, and to be able to get involved in Sudanese solidarity activism is to read the statements that are released by the resistance committees. For those that don't know, the resistance committees are grassroots revolutionary bodies that are found in basically every region and every city in Sudan. The RCs formed the backbone of the revolution and have formed the humanitarian grassroots response since the outbreak of the war. The resistance committee of Al-Fashir, for instance, has released 2 statements in the last week that, again, I think everybody should read. They're published on Facebook, and translations of them are usually spread across social media. One thing I think people can do to help and to spread awareness is to translate these statements into languages that there may not be enough information on Sudan in those languages. Like, I know it's very easy to find English and French translations, but I don't know about Spanish. I don't know about, other languages that have quite a large spread. And here, there's one thing that I hope people do not do, that I have seen some people do, which is trying to force a pre-existing narrative that doesn't exist within Sudanese circles. From what I've seen over the last few years, the Sudanese have a very good understanding of their situation, both internally, regionally, and internationally, and historically. And I've noticed there are some people who, when trying to understand Sudan, place on top of it a narrative that makes sense for them that already exists, but oftentimes that is just incorrect. It doesn't fit in with what the Sudanese are saying themselves, and does not really take into account the sort of specificities of this current situation and of Sudan as a whole. And again, one thing that I always like to mention whenever talking about centering voices of marginalized people is that the Sudanese are not a monolith. Here, we should always avoid simplifying or assuming that all Sudanese think in one mind, even those that oppose the RSF, who are the majority of people. There are, of course, disagreements, and I think those conversations are very important for people to be familiar with and to understand where they're coming from. And just to not oversimplify and reduce, Sudan to basically one perspective. With that said, second point. Number 2, civil war framing. So this is, I think, the one that I want to emphasize the most in terms of how I've seen well-intentioned people replicating a very harmful narrative. I have not seen a single Sudanese person who uses the civil war narrative. Because for the most part, it is not a civil war. It is not 2 segments of Sudanese society fighting against each other. What it is a foreign-backed militia fighting against the state, massacring civilians and pillaging the land, selling its riches to the highest bidder. This is, of course, not to absolve the Sudanese armed forces, which has its own history of atrocities and the like, but it is still not a civil war between, within the society. Some describe the war as a war of 2 generals. This I have seen some Sudanese use as like a framing, but it's definitely less preferred to others. And the idea is that you do have these 2 strong men, Al-Burhan and Hameti. And they were in power together, and the initial fighting is very much so, and still today, is between them. But it is still not a sort of sufficient framing to understand the situation. Now, one thing I have heard a lot of Sudanese talk about is this war as a counter-revolutionary war. Because this war did disrupt and bring to a halt a revolution which had been threatening so many establishment power structures within Sudan since its emergence in late 2018. Both Al-Burhan and Hameti worked together to crush the revolution, and essentially what is still playing out today is a crushing of that revolution, but by different means. Understanding that process, I think, is so important to situate the current war within a wider, very recent history, but also returns that agency to the Sudanese people. They rose up, they overthrew Omar al-Bashir, they have threatened the rule of not just the army, but also for sure of this genocidal militia. And in large part, this war, these takeovers of land, of people, these massacres, are a punishment for that attempt to, that constant resistance and attempt to create sovereignty for the people against this domination. Another framing that I've seen that I know a lot of Sudanese do advocate for this framing, and I've seen others that don't like it, which is proxy war. The RSF is very heavily backed by the United Arab Emirates. This is something that I've definitely seen a lot of people catch on to, and it's a very important point of what's happening, because this is a way that the genocide that is happening in the Darfur region, that the war as a whole, keeps going. Not only because the UAE is giving RSF money, but also because the UAE is benefiting from this conflict, because in return for their support, they are able to extract gold and other really valuable resources that are being found on the UAE market. And so there is this idea that, again, is not uniform, but is an important framing to understand that the RSF, it does not have a Sudanese agenda, that it is fighting on behalf of itself, but also for its regional and international patrons, most importantly, the United Arab Emirates. Number 3, learn the history. This, again, I think is just good advice for anyone who stands in solidarity with a struggle or movement or people. That is to take a bit of time to understand before speaking, before engaging. Again, here I will provide notes in the description or like other places that you can read more and understand this history. I personally don't think you need to go back that far. I don't think you need to go back to General Namairi in the 60s or the Egyptian-British colonial rule. But at the very least, understand the rule of Omar al-Bashir, the Sudanese revolution, and the coup by al-Burhan al-Hamati, and the current war that is still ongoing. Here, again, I don't think it is just learn to be informed, but also to be inspired. For instance, the resistance committees that I talked about a little bit ago are honestly some of the most powerful forms of organizing I've ever come across, not just contemporarily, but historically. And it's honestly just so frustrating that it's been largely ignored by the left across the globe. Like, they didn't just topple a dictator of 30 years, but they created a unique system of divisions of power, of democracy, of direct democracy, and of collaboration and free association that, again, I just don't see any other parallel. One such example of this is the Revolutionary Charter that was written over the course of 2 years and got the signatures of every resistance committee across Sudan. And it's an incredible document that, again, it's amazing. I just wish more people knew this existed and would read it and ultimately be inspired by it. And I think that brings us to point number 4. Number 4, humanitarian versus political. What's happening in Sudan is undoubtedly a humanitarian crisis and needs a humanitarian response. But with that said, a lot of the comments and footage and videos that I've seen, the ways it's being circulated, I think is at risk of being completely depoliticized. Like, for instance, the millions of people who are displaced are not displaced because of some natural disaster. This is a political decision. This is part of the efforts of the RSF to dominate in the regions that it has taken control over. And all of this comes in the context of a revolution, which sought to overthrow not just Omar al-Bashir and his dictatorship, but also military rule, and also the rule of the militia. Or how the RSF came to exist to begin with, back then known as the Janjaweed, that was also a political decision. And they have been a very important political tool at the hand of the Omar al-Bashir dictatorship. And, that reality still exists. And so we should always remember that these are not merely horrors. These are not merely tragedies, but injustices, crimes, things that are done to achieve political ends. All of this done on the back of the Sudanese people. And so resisting the depoliticization of this war is also, evident when talking about the foreign backing of the RSF and the geopolitical interests that are sort of vested in this genocidal militia. or the position of Sudan within the global supply chain. Or if you want to get a bit more abstract, even though it's not at all abstract, it's just a bit more history and stretches back a bit more time, the history of extractivism and colonialism in Africa by European and Western powers, which stretches back hundreds of years. All of this is deeply, deeply political, and we should never forget about it, and ignoring that aspect, I think, does a great injustice to the victims and the martyrs who have fallen at the hands of these neo-colonial and military rulers. Number 5, name the perpetrators. I think we've seen this time and again when it comes to Palestine, that it's very easy for people to say that 5 people were killed in Gaza, to say that, oh, it's so sad what's happening there, without naming who is doing it. And I think naming who is doing it is always such an important part of, again, being respectful to the victims, to the martyrs, to the revolutionaries, to the people of Sudan who are struggling under this war. And so whenever you talk about Al-Fashir or the Darfur, always name the Rapid Support Forces. Or you can call them the Janjaweed, which is like their original name. The RSF is kind of their slightly more like bureaucratized name. So some people talk about them as the Janjaweed to kind of rescind and remove from them that kind of like legitimizing, official sounding name, the RSF. Name as well the UAE, which I'm very glad I'm seeing a lot of people doing. And finally, people are listening to, the Sudanese who for 2 years have been talking about the UAE's role in backing the RSF and prolonging this war. Or, for instance, the United States and the United Kingdoms, who are the main weapons suppliers and sellers to the UAE, who then sell those weapons or like gift those weapons essentially to the RSF. But also in some cases, the UAE has been buying drones from China and sending them to the RSF in Sudan. Or you can talk about the EU's role in all of this, especially with the hundreds of millions of euros they gave the Omar al-Bashir dictatorship, which went to the RSF, in order to curb migration, which for the last 10 years has been the great obsession of what is now described, I think very importantly, Fortress Europe. And then also, you can talk about Israel. I mean, Israel has been so complicit in what is happening in Sudan and has been essentially working as a propaganda outlet with the UAE. And most absurdly, I remember a few months ago, there was an article written on Jerusalem Post calling the Sudanese army Hamas. And then beyond that, in a slightly more macroeconomic scale, you can talk about global capital and the supply chain with companies such as Mars Confectionery, who rely heavily on gum arabic, which Sudan produces a lot of. And so they have been cutting deals, which is very background and very shady stuff, with the RSF in order to ensure access to those resources. And I do want to emphasize that a lot of Sudanese do also talk about the Sudanese army, their atrocities, and also their insistence on military rule, which is part of the reason why we're here to begin with. At the moment, there's less criticism or discussion about the SAF because they are the chief fighting force against the RSF, but that is still something that needs to be bared in mind, and nobody should be whitewashing any, criminal entities or any entities or organizations or bodies that commit atrocities against the Sudanese. And so yes, in any case, I think it is always important to name the perpetrator when talking about crimes and injustices. Number 6, bear witness, but don't be passive. This, I think, is actually the very bare minimum. It's one thing for people to suffer, and it's another thing for people to suffer and feel like their suffering is in vain, that no one is watching, that no one cares. And so I think at the very bare minimum, we should not ignore what's happening and always bear witness. I'm not saying you have to watch every video, especially not the more intense ones, but I think there's something essential in being vocal about being a witness, about the things that you're seeing. I think that's something that's been very powerful out of Palestine for the last 2 years, wherein a lot of people, not just Palestinians, people from across the globe are just vocalizing that they have seen a thing, that they have seen a crime, that they have borne witness to injustice. And I think that has a multiplying effect that I think at the moment is not yet there with Sudan. And so, on the point of not being passive, I think there probably are, if you live in a city, already existing Sudanese, advocacy groups. And if not, make one. And otherwise, maybe you're part of a Palestine solidarity group. Put more Sudan into that. And not just in terms of slogans, not just free Palestine, free Sudan, but slogans that are, substantively about Sudan. Because again, every time I hear free Sudan, I always wonder, does that person know free Sudan from whom? And maybe if you're into chanting death, death to the EF, maybe you could also do death, death to the RSF. I don't know. That's just a thought. Number 7, humanize. Over the last 2 years, with the war and genocide in Palestine, I've definitely noticed something incredible shift in people. Something I'd never seen before in my life, something that I never thought I would see, which is that white people, people in Europe, in the US, are talking about Palestine, using the Arabic word. People are referencing texts, speeches that were originally in Arabic. People know Arabic names, the names of martyrs. They know, small relationships. People are talking about Hind Rajab, for instance. People are talking about Saleh al-Jafrawi, or people are using Arabic chants, And to me, there's something really powerful about that fact. And it bypasses, to me, a lot of very dehumanizing geopolitical analyses. It sees the people who have been dehumanized for so long as humans, as daughters, as parents, as friends, as lovers, And I think that creates new space for those people, for their struggle, for their suffering, and for the injustices done to them into your heart. And so I think that is one thing that I wish more people would do with Sudan. To really humanize people in Sudan. To read stories, learn their names, to, identify a bit more with them, and not just see them as suffering Black people in Africa. There, I know that sounded very harsh, but I think a part of humanizing Sudanese lives and Sudanese struggles is to decolonize our minds when it comes to African people. This is something that I've heard Sudanese people say over and over again. And I think anti-Black racism plays a huge role in so much of our socialization, and so much of our political discourse. But I think if we really want to be advocates for Sudan, we do have to see them as humans, fully. And in order to do that, we have to do work. We have to unlearn a lot of stuff. And again, I'm not going to assume too much about anyone listening, but that's something that, I think I had to do years ago. And that it's a lifelong process because we do live in a very entrenched white supremacist world. And in the context of Sudan, we do live in a very Arab-centric world, wherein Arab is seen as light-skinned, or at least ethnically Arab, in a way that kind of marginalizes the Sudanese and other Black Arabs. So, with that said, I think the last 3 points are very concrete, and we'll end this video with something for you to go off and do. Number 8, boycott and divestment. Again, I'm very glad I've been seeing a lot of people talk about the UAE, drawing parallels with Israel, especially in the sense that if you hate Israel, you should hate the UAE. If you hate what it's doing, you will hate what the UAE is doing. And so in that same way, we should be boycotting the UAE just as we boycott Israel. That means do not visit Dubai or Abu Dhabi or any of the Emirates. Don't fly with Emirates Air. Don't buy Emirati products. Definitely do not buy Emirati gold. Again, I will have something in the description of like an actual list of things to boycott. But all in all, what I think the boycott movements that we've seen around Israel push this idea of Israel as a pariah state. And I think that is something that we need to do with the UAE, in large part because of what it's doing in Sudan. But there's also so many other reasons to be treating the UAE as the dynastic monarchy petro state that is involved in numerous conflicts around the region, that is essentially a slave colony that is built from Western money and services US imperialist interests in the region. And it's just a disgusting place when you look more into it. I think I am probably going to do a video about why I hate the UAE, and you should too. Number 9, organize. So organize is definitely a word that I avoid using because it's so vague and I don't know what it means myself. I mean, I kind of do, but beyond what I'm already doing. And it's just a word that I think, again, I've heard Sudanese use it. And I've heard this is a demand from Sudanese people of people who want to stand in solidarity with them. And so, it depends on your own circumstance and your own context. Like I said earlier, maybe you can build it as an extension to other solidarity work you do, such as solidarity with Palestine. Or maybe it's something else entirely. I, for instance, believe that it is most effective for people to organize within their local context against their own government, with Sudan and Palestine in mind, in their hearts, but that not be the focus necessarily. Here, I don't want to spend too much time. I think this is also a whole other video, but I think it is much more effective for Palestine, for Sudan, for any other context that you want to stand in solidarity with, for you to first build a base where you're at. Find the leverage, find the coalitions, build political power within your own context, and then you can actually leverage that. And so maybe that's a political party, forming one or within an already existing one. Unions or associations, I don't know. I'm not going to get too much into it because it really depends on different contexts. But basically, I think there's a strong limitation to groups that are purely solidarity, that it's just about protests, it's just about making your voice heard. They're not listening. And so how do we make them listen? Here, I mean people with political and economic power. And so even though that's a bit lackluster, I think organize is definitely a part of this, even though it's a very vague term that needs to be fleshed out better. Number 10, donate. So as with the other things, I will have a list of people and organizations to donate to. Obviously, there's a preference to donate to local organizations, to activists who have connections with people on the ground. I don't have to make a case for this. People need money. They need housing, they need food, they need medicine. And personal donations go a really long way. And so even if it's a small amount, you can make a really big difference, again, in addressing the humanitarian situation. All the other stuff deals with the political, but this deals with that immediate humanitarian to help people survive under really incredibly cruel and criminal conditions. And so with that said, if you appreciate this video, if you like some of the work that I do, please consider donating to one of the organizations or individuals I have listed below. I'm not going to put my tip jar here because that would feel weird. But if you would give me money, give it to one of these organizations. And so with that said, I'll see you all in the next one.